Hi everyone. Okay, so in this video we're going to look at pivot points and kind of like how to manipulate and use pivot points in a scene. And as we talked about in the previous video, each object has a pivot point, right? And if we create a group is simply another pivot point, and a pivot point that can also function as a container, right? So if I have my move tool active, we'll be able to see that pivot point a little bit better. And if I move the sphere around, the sphere has its own pivot point, and the group has its own separate pivot point. And that is kind of a critical thing, and this will become especially important for those of you going on to do more animation related to Maya. Because as you will see, the location of this pivot point can affect the ways that we can move it. In particular, the thing that it really affects is rotation. So for example, if we move that pivot point, and the other thing, there's a couple ways you can move a pivot point around. One is I can just take the sphere inside, kind of move it around. So I've got this group here, right? And the group has its own pivot point, and I just moved the sphere, and the sphere has its own pivot point, right? And by default, this, an object that you create from the shelf here is always going to place the pivot point in the center of the object. And there are a couple of ways you can change the location of the pivot point. The easiest way is to simply move the pivot point without moving the object. And to do that, all you need to do is hold down the D key on the keyboard. And you'll see that as I do that, you'll see that my move tool kind of transitions to a kind of combination of the rotate and the move tool here. And then if I were to pull on one of the handles here, you can see that I can actually move my pivot point around. And now the sphere has a pivot point at a different position in space. So it's no longer at the center of the object. So if I were to rotate this sphere, it will now rotate around that pivot point, right? And that, again, is a critical thing, especially for animation, right? So if we were to animate a robot and we wanted to make a robot's arm, we would want that arm to kind of rotate around a certain joint. So now the other thing that we can do, if let's say our pivot point is in a kind of crazy position that we don't really want it to be in, so let's really screw it up here. Let's say we want to just sort of take that pivot point and return it to the center of the object. There is a way to do that. The easiest way is to simply double click on one of your tools here, so the move tool, the rotate tool, or the scale tool, and this will open up the tool settings. And inside the tool settings, there's a lot of different options, but among those is Edit Pivot and Reset Pivot. And if I simply hit the Reset button, it will take that pivot point and return it to the middle of whatever mesh you have currently selected. Edit Pivot is just another way of moving the pivot point. So if I click Edit Pivot, I can just move the pivot point. I think it's a little bit faster to just press the D key. So just as a sort of an aside there, but that's where you can reset the pivot. Okay. So now, the other critical thing is when we start to think about groups as pivot points for moving objects around. So let's just duplicate this sphere a little bit. And a lot of the time, you're going to need to kind of take a bunch of objects, place them into a group, and then that group is going to be a controller for a set of objects, right? So then you might need to kind of move the pivot point around, and then we'll be able to manipulate all of the objects using a single pivot point. Now, those are the basics of pivot points, and in the next video we're going to look at how to kind of do some alignment of objects using objects' pivot points and start to put all the lessons of the last two videos together.